The hangar sat in darkness, that particular kind of 3:45 in the morning darkness, where even the security lights seemed tired of their own glow. Airman Maya Torres moved between the shadows with the careful precision of someone who knew she was committing a felony but couldn't quite bring herself to stop. Her hands worked the fuel line connections on the A-10 Thunderbolt that wasn't supposed to be here, on a flight manifest that didn't exist, for a pilot who had walked out of the desert 3 hours ago with eyes that looked like they'd seen the end of something. The radio on the hangar wall crackled to life. Tower to unidentified personnel, you are not cleared for aircraft preparation. Identify yourself immediately. Torres reached up and switched it off. The silence that followed felt heavier than the words. Above her in the cockpit, Captain Sarah Brennan fastened her harness with movements so practiced they looked like meditation. Her face held no expression. Not calm, not determined, just empty in the way that a weapon is empty before someone picks it up and gives it purpose. Torres climbed halfway up the crew ladder, her voice barely carrying over the pre-flight system's hum. "Ma'am, they'll court-martial both of us." Sarah's hands continued their checklist dance across switches and dials. "Only if we fail." "What's the mission?" "Buying time for men who don't know I exist." The twin TF-34 turbofan engines began their startup sequence, a low growl that built into something that sounded less like machinery and more like hunger. The sound rolled across the flight line, waking up crew chiefs in distant hangars who would check their rosters and find nothing, see nothing, know nothing until the sun came up and someone important started asking questions they couldn't answer. Torres stepped back as the canopy began to close. Through the Lexan she could see Sarah's profile, backlit by red cockpit lighting, and for just a moment the younger woman understood why the old-timers at the officers' club went quiet when this particular captain's name came up in conversation. The A-10 began to taxi. No clearance, no call sign, no transponder code painting friendly on anyone's radar screen. Tower lights flashed red across the tarmac. Security alert, unauthorized movement. Sarah's voice came through one last time on the ground frequency, flat and final as a headstone. "Tower, I'm going dark. Court-martial me when I get back." Then she was gone into the Nevada night, and the only thing left behind was the smell of burnt JP-8 fuel and the sound of Torres whispering a prayer she hadn't said since basic training. The radio hissed with static, then a voice, male and deep and textured with the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. "Ash, you have 36 hours. After that, it's war." 48 hours earlier, the same woman sat in a different kind of darkness. The officers' club at Nellis Air Force Base held the particular amber glow of a Thursday night winding down, when the younger pilots had enough bourbon in them to start telling stories that weren't entirely true, and the older ones had enough sense to let them. Sarah Brennan occupied a corner stool at the bar, nursing her second drink with the kind of patience that suggested she had nowhere else to be and no hurry to get there. She wore her flight suit with the sleeves rolled to mid-forearm, no name tape, no unit patch, nothing that would invite questions. Just another pilot in a room full of pilots, except for the way she held herself, the way her eyes tracked movement without seeming to move at all. At a table near the window, a cluster of lieutenants in their mid-20s debated the merits of AI-assisted targeting systems with the passionate certainty of people who had never actually been shot at. One of them, a kid named Kai Novak with the kind of fresh-scrubbed face that made him look even younger than his 26 years, leaned back in his chair and raised his voice just enough to carry. "My flight instructor said Brennan flew some ghost mission back in '09. Saved 2 jets in a blizzard nobody could see through. Navigation systems down, weather satellites blind, the whole 9 yards of impossible. said she guided them home using lightning strikes for reference points. His wingman, a captain who flew F-16s and thought that made him important, laughed into his beer. Brennan, she's been desk-flying drones for 3 years, man. That's a fairy tale. Old-timers making up stories to scare the new guys. Sarah set down a $20 bill and stood. The movement was quiet, but somehow every conversation in the immediate vicinity stumbled, reset, continued at a lower volume. Novik noticed her for the first time, really noticed, and his eyes caught on something. The tattoo on her right wrist, visible for just a moment as she adjusted her sleeve. A hawk, small and precisely rendered, diving beneath a lightning bolt. But the ink was old, faded, and half of it disappeared into scar tissue, the kind of deliberate scarring that came from someone trying to burn something away and not quite succeeding. "Ma'am," he started, "that ink, is that from Gatefur?" Sarah's eyes found him, flat, unreadable. "Gatefur doesn't exist, Lieutenant." She walked past him, past the table, past the bar where the older pilots sat. One of them, a colonel in his 60s with silver hair and a face like weathered granite, stood up. Just stood. Didn't say a word. Brought his right hand up in a salute so subtle it might have been mistaken for adjusting his collar if you didn't know what you were looking at. Sarah nodded once. The colonel sat back down. Novik watched her leave, watched the door close behind her, then looked at his wingman. "Who the hell is she?" The colonel at the bar turned his glass slowly, studying the amber liquid like it held answers. He didn't look at the younger pilots when he spoke. "She's the reason some of us are still here to tell fairy tales." Sarah's apartment could barely be called that. Studio, 400 square feet, furniture that came with the place. The only personal items were a photograph and a model airplane. The photograph showed a younger version of herself, maybe 19, standing beside a man in his 50s wearing an Army colonel's uniform. Both of them squinting into sunlight, both of them smiling in that particular way that people smile when they're not used to it. Behind them, a C-130 transport sat on a runway somewhere hot and flat. The man's hand rested on her shoulder. Her hand rested on her first set of flight wings. Beneath the photo, someone had written in careful block letters, "Never fly higher than your heart." The model airplane sat on the windowsill, a crop duster, ancient yellow paint, hand-carved propeller, the kind of detail work that came from hours of patience and memory. No manufacturer's kit. Someone had built this from scratch. Sarah sat at her desk and opened a laptop that looked like it predated most of the pilots she'd seen tonight. The screen flickered to life, showing an email inbox filled mostly with automated system updates and spam. She started to close it, then stopped. There, between advertisements for flight gear and a notice about hangar maintenance, sat an email from an address that made her hand freeze on the trackpad. J. Hale, 1971 at. The timestamp read 10 years ago, 2009, December 15th, 2 days after they'd told her Major David Hale had died in a training accident that nobody wanted to talk about. But the email had arrived today. Sarah's breathing changed, not faster, slower, the way a sniper's breathing slows when the target appears. She clicked it open. No text, just an attachment, a WAV audio file, 8 seconds long. Her finger hovered over the play button for 3 full breaths, then pressed. Static first, the kind that came from old recording equipment or damaged files. Then a voice, distorted by digital noise but unmistakable. "Ash, if you're hearing this, I'm dead, and you're the only one left who can fly the line." The email deleted itself, not manually, automatically, a pre-programmed self-destruct running code that Hale had taught her when she was 23 and thought she knew everything. Sarah stood so fast her chair tipped backward. She grabbed her keys and ran. The apartment building's mailbox stood in a small alcove near the entrance, one of those old-fashioned setups with actual metal boxes and actual metal keys. Sarah's hand shook as she unlocked number 237. Inside, a manila envelope, no postage, no return address, hand-delivered by someone who knew where she lived. She tore it open. A USB drive fell into her palm, small and black and completely anonymous. Wrapped around it, a piece of paper covered in handwriting she recognized the way you recognize a voice in the dark. The ink looked fresh, but Sarah knew better. Thermochromic ink, the kind that faded when exposed to air above a certain temperature. She had maybe 3 minutes before the message disappeared completely. Grid 47.2 degrees north, 110.5 degrees west. Tanner Ridge, Montana. 8 men, 36 hours. Fire but don't kill, delay don't destroy. Solo, no comms, no support. When you're done, burn this in the drive. The signature was just a single word, hail. Sarah ran back upstairs, plugged the USB into her laptop. A single file, no text document, no mission brief, just a three-dimensional topographic map of a mountain range she'd never seen, rendered in the kind of detail that came from military-grade satellite imaging. Tanner Ridge, Montana, a maze of canyons and cliff faces that would shred an aircraft like paper if you didn't know exactly what you were doing. Overlaid on the map, a thermal image, recent, maybe 12 hours old, 8 heat signatures clustered in a narrow canyon, 40-plus signatures surrounding them, positioned on the high ground with the patient positioning of people who had all the time in the world. No labels, no explanation, no indication of who they were or why they mattered or what the hell Hale wanted her to do about it. Just coordinates, just numbers, just the kind of absolute trust that got people killed. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time. Then she looked at her wrist, at the half-burned tattoo of a hawk diving through lightning. She touched it without meaning to, and the touch brought back a memory she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. 3 seconds of flashback, sharp as gunfire. Hale's voice in a hospital room after they'd pulled her out of a frozen Wyoming canyon with frostbite and hypothermia, and a piece of aircraft shrapnel still embedded in her shoulder. When I'm gone, someone will call. Don't ask why. Just fly. She'd asked him what that meant. He'd smiled, that particular smile he used when he was teaching a lesson nobody wanted to learn. It means you're already dead, Ash. You died up there in that storm. Everything after is just borrowed time. So when I ask you to spend it, don't waste it on questions. Sarah came back to the present, her apartment, her laptop, her choice. She pulled the USB drive out, placed it on her desk, and brought down the hammer she kept in her tool drawer. 3 impacts. The drive shattered into pieces small enough that no recovery would ever be possible. Then she burned the paper in her kitchen sink, watching Hale's handwriting curl and blacken and disappear into ash. "Damn it, Hale," she whispered to the smoke. But she was already moving, already planning, already committed to something she didn't understand for reasons she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't flown with ghosts. The hangar access panel beeped once as Sarah pressed her thumb against it. Red light. Access denied. Her credentials had been deactivated 3 years ago when they'd moved her to drone operations. She pulled out a small device that looked like a phone but wasn't, held it against the panel, and watched the light cycle from red to amber to green. The lock clicked open. Hale had given her that device on her last day of active flight status. "You never know when you'll need to get somewhere you're not supposed to be," he'd said. "And when that day comes, you won't have time to ask permission." The hangar stretched before her in darkness, massive and empty, except for the single A-10 Thunderbolt II sitting under maintenance lighting. Tail number 447. Iron Maiden, according to the nose art some long-ago crew chief had painted below the cockpit. A woman in armor, sword raised, the kind of old-school artwork that would never be approved under current regulations, but had been grandfathered in through sheer longevity. Sarah stood in the shadows looking at the aircraft. 21,000 pounds of titanium bathtub wrapped around a gun that could put 30mm rounds through tank armor. Slow, ugly, outdated by every modern metric. Perfect. Lights came on, not the overheads, just a work lamp near the landing gear. Maya Torres stepped into view and the pistol in her hand was pointed at the ground but ready. "Ma'am, I almost shot you." Sarah didn't move. "I need her fueled and armed in 40 minutes. Torres lowered the weapon, but her face held the expression of someone doing math they didn't like the answer to. "You're not on the flight manifest." "I know." "Ma'am, this is career suicide. Yes, you can walk away, but if you stay, don't ask questions." Torres looked at Sarah, looked at the A-10, looked at her watch. Then she holstered her sidearm and walked to the fuel panel. The sound of her connecting the fuel line was the loudest thing in the hangar. They worked in silence for 30 minutes. Torres handled the external checks, the fuel load, the weapons systems. Sarah ran the internal pre-flight, systems coming online one by one, each green light a small commitment to something irreversible. Torres couldn't help herself. The question came out quiet, almost ashamed of its own existence. "Ma'am, is it true you flew Gatefire?" Sarah's hands paused on the avionics panel. "No one flew Gatefire. It's a myth." "But the tattoo is a mistake I made when I was young." Torres climbed up to the cockpit level, watching Sarah's face in the red glow of the instruments. She saw something there, something that made her voice even quieter. What was Gatefire really? Sarah's jaw tightened. A lesson in how many people you can fail and still wake up the next morning. The younger woman started to respond, then saw what Sarah was attaching to her shoulder panel. A patch, old and hand-sewn, the embroidery faded from age. 2 words: fire line. "What's fire line?" Sarah secured the patch, checked her harness connections, began the engine start sequence. Something Hale used to say: when you're out of options, find the line between fire and vanish. Fly it. "I don't understand." "You're not supposed to." The engine spun up, their distinctive whine building into a roar that rattled tools off workbenches. Torres stepped down from the ladder, watching as Sarah settled her helmet, secured her oxygen mask, became something less like a person and more like a component of the aircraft itself. The canopy began to close. Torres had to shout over the engine noise. "Ma'am, what if you don't come back?" Sarah's voice came through the external speakers, flat and final. "Then someone else will finish the story." The A-10 began to taxi, its movement heavy and purposeful like a predator that had just woken up hungry. Torres watched it roll toward the taxiway, unauthorized and unexplained, a ghost operation about to become very real. Her radio crackled, the tower demanding identification, the security frequency calling for immediate response. Torres reached down and unplugged both. Some things, she was beginning to understand, were more important than regulations. The taxiway lights flickered past Sarah's canopy, yellow and white, marking a path she wasn't supposed to take. Tower was screaming at her over every frequency, voices overlapping in a chaos of confusion and growing anger. "Unidentified A-10, you are not cleared for movement. Return to hangar immediately." Aircraft tail 447, identify yourself and state your intentions. All units, we have an unauthorized aircraft preparing for departure. Security to runway 03. Sarah's finger found the radio selector, switched to tower frequency one last time. Her voice carried none of the urgency they were throwing at her. Just words, spoken with the finality of someone who had already made a decision and found peace with its consequences. Tower, I'm going dark. Court-martial me when I get back. She flipped the transponder to standby. On radar screens across the base, the blip labeled N447 flickered and vanished, became nothing, became a ghost. The runway stretched ahead, 3,000 meters of concrete disappearing into darkness. Sarah advanced the throttles. The A accelerated with the enthusiasm of a freight train, slow and inevitable and utterly committed to its trajectory. Rotation speed. She pulled back on the stick. The nose lifted. The rumble of wheels on concrete ceased, replaced by the smooth violence of controlled flight. Behind her, Nellis Air Force Base erupted into controlled chaos. Ahead, the night sky opened like a question mark. And somewhere in the darkness, 36 hours had already started counting down. 300 miles away, in a facility that officially didn't exist beneath Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, General Marcus Briggs stood in front of a wall of screens showing things that officially weren't happening. He was 58 years old and looked every day of it. Silver hair cut military precise, a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of mark that came from shrapnel and luck in approximately equal measure. Eyes that had seen enough classified briefings to know that the worst news always came with the most sanitized language. Right now, those eyes were locked on a satellite feed showing a compound in the mountains of eastern Montana, 50 miles from anything that mattered, surrounded by terrain that would kill you if the people inside didn't do it first. The woman standing beside him was younger by 15 years, but carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who knew secrets that generals didn't. Emma Voss, CIA. The kind of analyst who got pulled into operations because she understood that intelligence gathering and trigger pulling were sometimes the same job. She gestured at the screen with a laser pointer. 3 prisoners confirmed inside, sir. American. Captured 18 months ago during a black operation in Syria that we still can't acknowledge happened. Intel says they're being transferred to Russia in 38 hours. This is our only extraction window. Briggs studied the thermal imaging, the guard rotations, the vehicle patterns. How long until Delta gets in position? 36 hours to infiltrate, but there's a problem. There's always a problem. Voss pulled up another screen. Local militia is moving 100-plus fighters toward the compound for what they're calling security handoff. If Delta engages that force, it becomes an international incident. Russia uses it as justification for a dozen things we don't want. We need those fighters delayed. Briggs nodded slowly. So we need air support that doesn't officially exist, buying time for an operation that isn't officially happening, to rescue prisoners who were never officially captured. Exactly. He was about to respond when an alarm chirped. Soft, but in the silence of the operations center, it might as well have been a gunshot. A radar technician at the far end of the room looked up, confused. Sir, we have an unidentified A-10 that just went dark over Nevada airspace. Transponder off, heading northeast. No flight plan filed. Briggs closed his eyes. The gesture was less about pain and more about the weary recognition of inevitability. Son of a bitch, Hale actually did it. Voss turned to him. Hale's been dead for 10 years. His contingency plan isn't. Briggs walked to a terminal, entered a password that cycled through 3 different authentication protocols, and pulled up a file that had been sealed since 2009. Operation Fire Line. Eyes only. The kind of classification that meant even asking about it could end careers. The file contained a photograph. A younger woman, maybe 24, standing beside a man in his 50s. Major David Hale and Captain Sarah Brennan, both in flight suits, both looking at the camera with the kind of expression that suggested they'd just survived something they probably shouldn't have. Beneath the photo, a single paragraph of text. Asset Captain S. Brennan. Callsign, Ash. Specialty, unsupported solo operations in denied territory. Activation protocol, upon Hale's death and critical mission need. Asset has been informed of contingency but not of specific activation triggers. Deniability, total. Voss read over his shoulder, her voice dropping to something almost reverent. He set her up as a ghost weapon, 10 years ago. Longer than that, Briggs said quietly. He started training her the day she survived gate fire. Told me once that some pilots are too good to waste on normal operations. That the really valuable ones are the ones who can fly missions that never happened. The radar tech called out again, more urgent this time. Sir, do we scramble interceptors? Briggs looked at the screen showing Sarah's last known position, then at the screen showing the compound in Montana, then at his watch. 36 hours. He picked up a phone that connected to exactly 4 other phones in the world. When the person on the other end answered, Briggs didn't bother with identification. All stations, A-10 Tail 447 is not rogue. Repeat, not rogue. But we never had this conversation. She hung up. Voss watched him, her analyst's mind already working through implications. Sir, if she fails, if she gets shot down in U.S. airspace on an unauthorized mission. Then I never knew her, Briggs finished. And Hale's file gets buried so deep no one will ever find it. But if she succeeds. He let the sentence hang. They both knew how this worked. Success meant the mission never happened. Failure meant it never happened either. The only difference was how many people died before the official silence set in. Voss looked back at the screens. Who is she really? A ghost, Briggs said, the best kind. The kind that scares other ghosts. 5 hours later, Sarah's cockpit was a world of red light and instrument glow, and the constant background hum of systems keeping her alive at altitude. She'd flown through the night, navigation lights dark, radio silent, threading through commercial air corridors like a shadow that the FAA would find gaps for later and quietly pretend had never existed. Tanner Ridge appeared on her forward display as the sun began to paint the eastern sky. Montana wilderness. Thousands of square miles of nothing interrupted by occasional somethings, all of it looking exactly like the kind of place where people could die and nobody would notice for weeks. She descended to 500 feet, then 300, then lower still, until the terrain below was close enough that she could see individual trees, and her radar altimeter was screaming warnings she'd disabled hours ago. The canyon system opened before her, narrow, technical, the kind of flying that required constant attention and left no room for error. Sarah switched to thermal imaging. 8 heat signatures, clustered in a defensive position at the bottom of a canyon that looked like God had taken an axe to the landscape. 43 signatures surrounding them on the high ground, positioned with the patience of professionals who knew their targets weren't going anywhere. She switched to the encrypted frequency Hale had given her. Just a number, no context, no indication of who might be listening. Reaper 9, this is Ash. You have air support. 3 seconds of silence, then a voice, male and rough with fatigue and something else. Disbelief maybe, or hope wearing a disguise. Ash, we were told no air available. told to hold position until extraction but no support inbound. You were told wrong, mark your position, I'm coming low. The voice sharpened, define low. Sarah looked at her altitude readout, 75 feet and dropping, lower than you've ever seen. She banked into the canyon, walls rising on both sides, the world narrowing to a corridor of stone and sky and the constant probability of death. Muzzle flashes sparked from the ridgeline. Rounds pinged off her armored cockpit, sounding like hail on a tin roof. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon spun up, its 7 barrels beginning their rotation with a sound that was less mechanical and more organic, like some huge predator clearing its throat. Sarah's finger rested on the trigger, 43 targets painted on her HUD, 43 easy kills. She didn't take them. Instead, she fired into the radio truck parked on the eastern ridge. 30-millimeter rounds tore through metal and electronics, the vehicle erupting in a shower of sparks and smoke. She adjusted her aim, fired again, and the ammunition cache beside it detonated in a secondary explosion that sent fighters scrambling for cover. One more burst. The flagpole they'd erected, some kind of territorial marking, sheared in half and toppled, the flag disappearing into the canyon below. 0 casualties. She pulled up hard, clearing the canyon rim by less than 20 feet, and climbed back to patrol altitude. The voice on the radio came back, and now it carried something new. Not hope, understanding. Ash, you had clean kills. Multiple, why didn't you take them? Because my orders are to make them angry, not dead. What kind of orders? The kind you don't question, Captain. Silence on the line, then quieter almost to himself. Who the hell are you? Sarah didn't answer. She was watching her fuel gauge, 40% remaining, checking her ammunition counter. 300 rounds expended, 2,000 remaining, calculating time and distance and the mathematics of survival. Below, she could see the fighters regrouping, more cautious now, confused by an attack that had destroyed their equipment but left them alive. They'd be trying to figure out what it meant, whether it was mercy or mockery or some tactical calculation they didn't understand. Good, confusion was the point. She climbed to 500 feet and began a wide orbit around the canyon, letting them see her, letting them know she was still there, still watching, still holding all the cards. Her radio crackled, not the encrypted frequency, the enemy's frequency, which she'd been monitoring since the moment she'd entered their airspace. The transmission was in Pashto, but Sarah had spent enough time in enough places to understand the important parts. Commander Raisin is coming. 6 hours. He wants the American pilot alive. Says he'll hang her body from the radio tower as warning to others. Sarah checked her watch. 6 hours. Delta Force needed 30. She needed to buy 24 more hours than Raisin was willing to give her. She keyed the encrypted frequency one more time. Reaper 9 actual, how long until your extraction? The voice that answered belonged to someone who was clearly the team leader. Older, steadier, used to making decisions in situations where all the options were bad. 90 minutes minimum, could be longer depending on variables we don't control. Understood, I'll keep them distracted. With what? Your one aircraft. They've got numbers, position, and now they're calling in reinforcements with air defense capabilities. Sarah looked at her reflection in the canopy glass, saw a woman who died once before and wasn't particularly afraid of doing it again. Then I'll make sure I'm more annoying than I am valuable. She banked away from the canyon, heading toward the ridgeline where the fighters had taken cover. Time to teach them that sometimes the scariest thing about a weapon isn't whether it fires. It's whether it chooses not to. The sun climbed higher, painting the Montana wilderness in shades of gold and shadow. Somewhere far below, 8 men waited in a canyon, surrounded by enemies who didn't yet understand that their biggest problem wasn't the soldiers in front of them. It was the ghost circling overhead, buying time measured in heartbeats and ammunition, and the careful mathematics of controlled violence. Sarah's watch read 5 hours and 42 minutes until Raisin arrived. 34 hours and 18 minutes until Delta reached extraction. And somewhere in the numbers between those two countdowns lived the difference between mission success and another story that would never be told. She armed her next weapons system and descended back into the canyon. The hunt had just begun. Captain Derek Shelton had been leading special operations teams for 14 years, long enough to recognize when something didn't add up. He crouched behind a boulder in the canyon bottom, tablet computer balanced on his knee, running searches that shouldn't have been possible on a military network that was supposed to be secure. Call sign Ash, no results. Female A-10 pilot, current roster, no matches. He tried a different approach, Gatefire plus A. The search hung for 3 seconds, then returned a single redacted file. Most of it was blacked out, the digital equivalent of someone taking a marker to classify documents. But fragments remained, enough to sketch the outline of something impossible. Pilot name redacted. Mission Guide 2 damaged F-16 aircraft through Category 4 winter storm system via non-standard pathfinding methods. Visibility 0. Navigation systems offline. Outcome mission success. All aircraft recovered. Method classified. At the bottom of the file, a single line in smaller text. Pilots subsequently reassigned to non-combat operations, pending psychological evaluation and command review. Shelton looked up at the sky where the A-10 had disappeared, then back at his screen. She flew blind, he said to no one in particular, through a storm that grounded every other aircraft on the base, brought 2 jets home when everyone had written them off. Beside him, Sergeant Luis Mateo checked his rifle with the careful attention of someone who knew that maintenance mattered more than faith. Mateo was 32, quiet in the way that some men are quiet because they've learned that listening saves lives. Latino features, careful eyes, and something else that Shelton had never quite been able to identify. A distance, maybe. Like part of Mateo was always somewhere else, doing calculations the rest of them weren't privy to. Sir, Mateo said without looking up from his weapon, whoever she is, she's not here by accident. Someone sent her. Shelton closed the tablet, someone who's been dead for 10 years. The radio crackled, enemy frequency. They'd been monitoring it since the first contact, listening to confused reports in Pashto and Arabic and occasionally Russian. Shelton's interpreter, a specialist named Chen who looked young enough to be in high school but spoke 7 languages fluently, translated in real time. Commander Raisin is inbound. ETA 6 hours. Air defense systems with him. They're saying once he arrives, the American pilot won't last 10 minutes. Shelton keyed his encrypted channel. Ash, you copy that. 3 seconds of silence. Then her voice, calm as someone ordering coffee. I copy. 6 hours until the party gets interesting. They have surface-to-air missiles coming. Then I'll fly lower than their missiles can track. There's a minimum altitude for that aircraft. There's a minimum altitude for surviving, Captain. I plan to stay just above it. Shelton wanted to ask more questions, wanted to demand answers about who authorized this mission and what the real objective was and how a single pilot expected to hold off 100 fighters. But something in her voice, that absolute certainty, made the questions feel pointless. Instead, he asked the only thing that mattered. How long can you keep them occupied? As long as you need me to. We need 30 hours. Her laugh came through the radio, brief and dark. Then you better hope I'm as good as the fairy tales say. The connection cut. Shelton looked at his team. 8 men pressed into a canyon that would become a killing ground the moment Raisin arrived with overwhelming force. They'd been told this was a reconnaissance mission. Observe and report, nothing more. But reconnaissance missions didn't get ghost pilots and orders to hold position against impossible odds. Someone was lying. The only question was whether they were lying to protect the mission or protect themselves. Mateo spoke again, his voice carrying something that might have been amusement. "Sir, you ever consider that maybe we're not the mission?" "What?" "Maybe we're the distraction." Shelton's jaw tightened. "That would make us bait." Mateo shrugged. "Bait catches fish. Sometimes that's more valuable than the fishermen." Before Shelton could respond, the A-10 reappeared, screaming over the canyon rim at an altitude that made his tactical brain scream warnings about vertical clearance and controlled flight. Sarah's voice came through again, but this time it wasn't directed at them. She was broadcasting on the enemy frequency, and she was speaking Pashto. The interpreter's eyes went wide. "Sir, she just told them that she's circling until they get bored or brave. Then she asked which one they think will happen first." Shelton started to laugh, caught himself, failed to stop completely. "She's conducting psychological warfare." Someone behind him, probably Morrison, the team's youngest operator, whispered what they were all thinking. "I think I'm in love." The canyon walls threw back the sound of the A-10's engines, doubling and tripling the noise until it seemed like there were multiple aircraft. Sarah was using the terrain like an amplifier, making herself seem larger and more numerous than reality. Shelton watched her execute a turn that should have been aerodynamically impossible at that speed and altitude. The aircraft rotating around a point in space with precision that looked less like flying and more like geometry made violent. Mateo's voice was quiet. "She's not Air Force standard." "No," Shelton agreed. "She's something else entirely." Sarah's fuel gauge read 35% and dropping. Each pass over the canyon cost her. Each climb and dive and tactical maneuver burning through JP-8 fuel at a rate that the engineers who designed the A-10 had never intended. She had maybe 90 minutes of flight time remaining, possibly less if she had to engage in serious combat maneuvering. The math was simple and unforgiving. She needed to refuel or she needed to land, and landing meant the mission was over. She pulled up her navigation display, overlaying it with the topographic map Hale had provided. There, 15 miles northwest, a stretch of access road that ran alongside an abandoned mining operation, long enough for an emergency landing if she was willing to accept the risk, isolated enough that she could work without being immediately discovered. She banked toward it, descending to 200 feet, using the terrain to mask her approach from any observers in the canyon. The road appeared, exactly where the map said it would be, a strip of packed dirt and gravel cutting through wilderness that looked like it hadn't seen human activity in decades. Sarah deployed her landing gear, felt the familiar thunk and drag as the wheels locked into position, and brought the A-10 down with a precision that came from 15 years of practice and a healthy respect for what happened when you got it wrong. The touchdown was hard but controlled. She used full braking, felt the anti-skid system pulse under her feet, and brought the aircraft to a stop with maybe 50 meters of road remaining. Engine shut down. Sudden silence except for the ticking of cooling metal and the wind through the pines. Sarah popped the canopy and climbed out, her legs stiff from hours in the cockpit, her body reminding her that she wasn't 25 anymore, and probably should have used the bathroom before taking off on an unauthorized combat mission. The emergency fuel bladder was stored in the rear equipment bay, a thick rubber container that held 500 gallons and weighed more than she did when full. It was designed to be handled by ground crew with proper equipment, not by a single pilot with a hand pump and diminishing patience. She pulled it out, connected the hose to the aircraft's fuel port, and began pumping. Each stroke of the handle moved half a gallon. 500 gallons meant 1,000 pumps. Her shoulders started burning at pump 50. Her hands developed blisters at pump 120. She kept pumping. The wilderness around her was silent except for the rhythmic squeak of the pump handle and her own breathing. No traffic, no aircraft overhead, no sign that the 21st century existed anywhere within 100 miles. Sarah's mind wandered the way minds wander during physical labor, finding memories she hadn't invited. She was 16 again, standing beside her father's crop duster on a strip of farmland outside Wichita. The plane had run out of fuel 3 miles from the airport, and her father had landed it in a cornfield with a precision that made the local news. They'd walked back to the farmhouse, borrowed a fuel bladder and a hand pump, and spent 3 hours in the August heat refueling the aircraft 1/2 gallon at a time. Her father had shown her how to hold the pump handle, how to use her whole body instead of just her arms, how to find a rhythm that could sustain itself for hours. Flying isn't about the machine, Sarah. It's about will. When you run out of fuel, you find more. When you run out of altitude, you fly lower. When you run out of time, you make them waste theirs. She'd asked him what happened when you ran out of will. He'd smiled, that particular smile he used when teaching lessons about things that couldn't be taught. Then you remember why you started flying in the first place, and you find it again. Sarah came back to the present. Montana wilderness. Hand pump. 240 strokes completed, 760 remaining. She kept pumping. Her radio crackled. Enemy frequency again. She'd left it on, monitoring their communications even while grounded. The voice speaking was different now, more authoritative, and the dialect marked him as someone educated, military-trained, possibly Russian-influenced. The translation formed in her mind as she listened. Commander Raisin to forward units. American aircraft has withdrawn. Likely returned to base for fuel and ammunition. Maintain defensive positions. When aircraft returns, we will be ready with air defense. This pilot has made a mistake. She has shown us she is alone. Sarah looked at her watch. 5.5 hours until Raisin arrived. She had maybe 2 hours of work remaining on the fuel bladder, then she needed to be airborne again. The math was getting tighter. She increased her pumping speed, accepting the pain in her shoulders, and the way her hands were starting to bleed where the blisters had broken. Pain was just information. Information could be acknowledged and then ignored. Pump 500, pump 501, pump 502. The fuel gauge on the bladder showed half empty, or half full, depending on whether you were an optimist or a realist. Sarah had stopped being either a long time ago. She was just someone who needed 498 more gallons of fuel and had exactly one way to get it. She kept pumping. The sun climbed higher, and in the canyon 15 miles away, 8 men waited for a ghost to return. Shelton had spread his team across the defensive position, every angle covered, every sight line calculated. They were professionals, Delta Force operators who'd been selected from the best that Army Rangers and Special Forces could provide. They knew their jobs, and they did them with the quiet competence that came from training that never really stopped. But they were also human, and humans got tired, and tired people made mistakes. Morrison was on watch at the north position when he spotted movement on the ridgeline. Not fighters, something else. He keyed his radio. "Boss, we've got a vehicle approaching. One of those technical trucks with a heavy machine gun mounted." Shelton low-crawled to Morrison's position, raised his binoculars. The truck was moving slowly, carefully, picking its way along a route that would bring it to a position overlooking their canyon. And on the truck bed, clearly visible, was a Cord heavy machine gun, 12.7 millimeter, the kind of weapon that could tear through body armor and light cover like tissue paper. "How long until it's in position?" 10 minutes. "Where's our air support?" Morrison scanned the sky. Negative contact, she's still gone. Shelton did the math. If that gun got set up, they'd be pinned down completely, unable to move without exposing themselves to fire that would kill them before they heard the shot. And with Raisin inbound with reinforcements, being pinned meant being dead. He keyed the encrypted frequency. "Ash, we have a technical with heavy weapons moving into overwatch position. Need immediate air support." Static, then more static, then nothing. Morrison looked at him. "Sir." Shelton tried again. "Ash, respond." The silence stretched. 30 seconds, 45, a minute. Chen, the interpreter, spoke quietly. "Sir, enemy comms are saying the American pilot has abandoned us. They're celebrating." Shelton's jaw worked. "She didn't abandon us. She can't respond because she's too far away or her radio's off or she's dead," someone finished. "No," Shelton said, with more certainty than he felt. "She's coming back." "Sir, that truck will be in position in 8 minutes. Then we hold for 8 minutes. But privately, in the part of his mind that did calculations without emotion, Shelton began running the numbers for a fighting retreat that would probably get half his team killed and accomplish nothing except dying in a slightly different location. Sarah finished pump stroke 900 at hour 12 of the mission, her hands raw meat wrapped in torn fabric from her emergency kit. She'd been at this for 90 minutes, and her body was screaming protests that she'd stopped listening to around pump 600. 2 more minutes, 100 more pumps, then she could fly again. She'd heard Shelton's radio call 15 minutes ago, heard the desperation he was trying to hide. She'd been too far away to respond, fuel bladder pump in her hands, knowing that stopping to answer would cost her time she couldn't afford to lose. Pump 950. Her vision swam. She blinked sweat out of her eyes and kept working. Pump 980. The bladder was almost empty, the aircraft's tank almost full. Pump 1000. Sarah dropped the handle, staggered to the side, leaned against the fuselage while her arms shook with muscle fatigue. 500 gallons, enough for maybe 4 hours of combat flying if she was careful, less if she had to push the engines hard. She climbed back into the cockpit, hands barely able to grip the ladder rungs. Her watch showed 6 minutes since Shelton's call. The technical would be in position in 2 minutes. Engine start sequence. The turbines spun up grudgingly, like they resented being asked to work again after such a short rest. She didn't blame them. Her whole body hurt in ways that would require a full day of ice and ibuprofen to address. But Delta Force didn't have a day. They had about 90 seconds before that technical got into position and started killing them. She taxied back onto the dirt road, advanced the throttles, felt the A-10 accelerate with fuel-heavy sluggishness. Rotation, liftoff, gear retraction, turned toward the canyon at maximum speed. The A-10 Thunderbolt was not a fast aircraft. It had been designed for loitering, for patience, for the kind of close air support that required staying in the fight rather than getting there quickly. Maximum speed was 380 knots on a good day, less when loaded with fuel and weapons. Sarah pushed it to 400, accepting the airframe stress warnings, the engine temperature climbing into amber territory, all the small mechanical protests that said she was asking for things the designers hadn't intended. The aircraft shuddered but complied. Distance to canyon, 14 miles. Time at current speed, 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The technical would be in position in 90 seconds. Sarah armed her cannon, checked her targeting systems, and descended to 100 feet, using terrain masking to hide her approach until the last possible second. The radio crackled with Shelton's voice, trying to sound calm and almost succeeding. All stations prepare for contact. When that gun opens up, we disperse to fallback positions. Acknowledge. 7 voices responded in sequence. Professional, controlled, ready. Sarah keyed her radio. Belay that order, Captain. Shelton's relief was audible. Ash, where the hell have you been? Making sure I don't run out of gas in the middle of your rescue. Stand by for immediate air support. The canyon appeared ahead, and Sarah could see the technical now, picked out on her targeting display. The truck had stopped at the optimal firing position, and men were dismounting, beginning the process of stabilizing the heavy machine gun. She had maybe 90 seconds before they were operational. Sarah dropped to 70 feet, the canyon walls rising on both sides, her airspeed bleeding off as she converted velocity into maneuverability. The truck grew larger in her HUD, the targeting reticle settling over it with the finality of a decision made. The rules of engagement Hale had given her were clear. Fire but don't kill, delay but don't destroy, make them waste time, not blood. But rules were tools, and tools could be adapted when the situation demanded it. She fired a 3-second burst from the GAU-8. 30mm rounds walked across the terrain, starting 20 meters in front of the truck and marching toward it like the footsteps of God. The first rounds hit dirt. The second batch hit rock. The third shredded the truck's front tires and engine block. The vehicle lurched sideways, heavy machine gun tilting, the crew diving for cover as metal fragments and rock chips filled the air like shrapnel. 0 casualties, but the truck was disabled, the gun unusable, and the fighters were scrambling away from what they now understood was a kill zone. Sarah pulled up, clearing the ridge by less than 15 feet, and climbed back to patrol altitude. Shelton's voice came through, and for the first time it carried something that might have been amusement. Ash, that was the most aggressive non-lethal engagement I've ever seen. Thank you, Captain, I do my best. How much ammunition do you have left? Enough to be annoying for several more hours. And after that? Sarah looked at her ammunition counter. 1,700 rounds remaining. At combat expenditure rates, maybe 10 more engagements before she was Winchester, firing on empty. After that, I get creative. She banked into another orbit, eyes scanning the ridgelines for new threats. The fighters below were regrouping, more cautious now, setting up positions with better cover. They were learning. That was fine. Sarah had always been a better teacher than student anyway. In the Underground Operations Center, beneath Peterson Air Force Base, General Briggs watched multiple screens showing data he wasn't supposed to have about an operation that didn't officially exist. Emma Voss stood beside him, tablet in hand, updating him with information that kept getting worse. Delta Force is still 28 hours from extraction position, but our intel just confirmed Raisin's convoy includes 3 SA-18 shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile systems. If even one of those gets a lock on her. She's alone, low on fuel, and about to face enemies with weapons that can kill her from 2 miles away, Briggs finished. I'm aware of the problem. Sir, we need to recall her. Send in official air support. Accept that this operation goes public and deal with the diplomatic fallout. Briggs was quiet for a long moment, studying the satellite feed showing Sarah's aircraft circling the canyon like a protective bird above a nest. Can't do that. Sir, she'll die. Probably. But if I send in official support, Russia uses it as justification for full military response to our presence in their operational area. 3 prisoners get executed immediately as spies. The diplomatic incident escalates into something that makes the news for months, and everyone asks questions about how American prisoners got captured in Syria during operations we swore weren't happening. So we let one pilot die to protect political stability. Briggs's voice hardened. I let one pilot do the job she volunteered for because she understands the math better than either of us. Voss looked at him and her analyst's mind read between the lines. You knew Hale. 15 years. He trained me when I was a captain who thought I understood what war looked like. What did he teach you? That the most valuable soldiers aren't the ones who win battles. They're the ones who prevent the battles everyone else would lose. On the screen, Sarah's aircraft jinked hard left, evading something that had been fired at her. The thermal imagery showed a brief smoke trail, probably an RPG, passing through the space where she'd been half a second earlier. Voss watched the near miss. She's running out of luck. No, Briggs said quietly. She's running out of time. Luck was never part of the equation. Our A-10 found Sarah in a fight that had evolved from tactical chess into something more like existential mathematics. How many near misses could accumulate before probability caught up? How long could reflexes stay sharp when fatigue made every decision feel like it was happening underwater? How much longer could an aircraft hold together when it was being asked to perform maneuvers at altitudes where a single mistake meant instant death against canyon walls? She'd been fired at 47 times. Small arms mostly, nothing that could penetrate the titanium bathtub protecting her cockpit, but enough to remind her that every pass over the canyon was a roll of dice weighted against her. Her right engine was running hot, temperature gauge hovering in the amber zone that meant something was degrading but not yet critical. Probably a fuel line developing a slow leak, or a cooling system that was clogged with dust, or any of a dozen small failures that accumulated in combat until they became one large failure with permanent consequences. She adjusted her flight pattern, spending more time outside the canyon, making them wonder when she'd come back instead of knowing she was always overhead. Psychological pressure through absence instead of presence. The enemy radio traffic had changed over the last hour. Less chatter, more discipline. Someone was coordinating them, giving orders that suggested professional military training. Probably Raisin's advance element, scouts sent ahead to prepare for his arrival. Sarah checked her watch. 5 hours until Raisin arrived with his SAM systems and overwhelming force. 26 hours until Delta reached extraction position. The gap between those numbers was where she lived now, in the space between impossible and merely suicidal. Her radio crackled, Shelton's voice careful. Ash, can I ask you something? Depends on the question, Captain. Why are you really here? This isn't a normal air support mission. You're not on any roster, not following any standard protocol. Someone sent you to do something specific, and I don't think protecting my team is it. Sarah was quiet for several seconds, choosing words. What makes you think you're not the mission? Because we're Delta Force operators on a reconnaissance assignment that every instinct tells me is cover for something else. And you're a pilot who flew through a blizzard blind 10 years ago and then disappeared from active service. People like you don't get pulled out of storage for babysitting jobs. You're smarter than average, Captain. Comes with the job, so what's the real mission? Above your pay grade and mine. Shelton's laugh was dark. Try me. Sarah banked into another turn, considering how much truth to share. Captain, have you asked yourself why you're in this specific canyon? Why your team was positioned here rather than anywhere else in Montana? We were told it was optimal for observing enemy movement patterns in the region. And do you believe that? Silence on the line, then quietly no. Neither do I, Sarah said, which means someone smarter than both of us put you here for a reason, and my job is to keep you alive long enough to find out what that reason is. By not killing anyone. Correct. That's a hell of a way to fight a war. Sarah thought about Hale, about lessons learned in hospital rooms and debriefing sessions, and the long silences between missions. It's the only way to fight the wars that don't officially exist, Captain. Before Shelton could respond, Chen's voice came through on the team frequency. Sir, enemy communications just went encrypted. They switched to a digital system we can't intercept. Which means Raisin's definitely close, Shelton said. When he arrives, things escalate fast. Sarah checked her fuel, 45%, ammunition, 1,400 rounds, engine temperature, still amber but climbing toward red. Then I better make these next 5 hours count. She descended back into the canyon, and the dance began again. The sniper appeared at hour 22, and Sarah almost didn't spot him in time. He was good, professional-grade good, positioned on a ridge 700 meters from Delta's location with a clear line of sight and the patience to wait for the perfect shot. Sarah only noticed him because of a momentary sun reflection off his scope, a tiny flash of light that her peripheral vision caught while she was scanning for other threats. She pulled up the thermal imaging enhanced magnification. The sniper was prone behind a rock formation, nearly invisible, his rifle aimed not at Shelton but at Mateo. Interesting target selection, either random or very specifically chosen. Sarah cycled through her weapons options. A direct hit with the GAU-8 would kill the sniper and probably vaporize the rock he was hiding behind, but that violated her orders. No kills. She needed precision, needed to disable without destroying, needed to be surgical in a situation that called for a scalpel when all she had was a cannon. An idea formed, the kind of idea that would make sense to exactly nobody, except someone who'd spent 15 years learning that aircraft could do things their designers never imagined. Sarah descended to 80 feet, aligned her approach vector, and calculated angles that existed more in intuition than mathematics. The sniper was focused downrange, tracking Mateo's movement, probably calculating windage and elevation for a shot that would come in the next 30 seconds. She fired. A 1-second burst, 30 rounds, but aimed not at the sniper, at the rock formation 2 feet to his left. 30-millimeter rounds hit stone at supersonic velocity. The rock didn't just break, it shattered, sending fragments in all directions like a fragmentation grenade. The sniper's rifle was torn from his hands, his scope shattered, his position compromised. Alive but ineffective. Sarah pulled up, climbed back to patrol altitude. Shelton's voice carried disbelief. Ash, did you just shoot the ground next to a sniper? Physics did the rest, Captain. That's impossible accuracy. No, that's understanding that sometimes the area around the target is more valuable than the target itself. She banked away, checking her ammunition counter. 1,370 rounds, still enough for another 8 or 9 engagements before she ran dry. Below, Mateo had moved to cover, unaware how close he'd come to dying. Shelton was scanning the ridgelines, trying to understand what kind of pilot could make a shot like that at that range under combat conditions. The answer was sitting in a cockpit 50 miles away in General Briggs's memory. Because 15 years ago, Briggs had been the one to recruit Sarah for Hale's Ghost program. He'd watched her qualification scores, studied her psychological evaluations, seen the particular combination of skill and detachment that made someone capable of impossible things. He'd asked Hale what made her special. Hale had smiled. She died once, Marcus. Really died. Heart stopped, breath stopped, the whole clinical definition. They brought her back, but something changed. Now she operates like someone who's already accepted the worst outcome. No fear, just calculation. That doesn't sound healthy. It's not, but it makes her the best person I know for missions where healthy people would hesitate. Briggs had approved the recruitment, had signed the orders that made Sarah disappear from normal operations and reappear in files that only 4 people in the Pentagon could access. Now, watching her defend 8 men with a broken aircraft and impossible orders, he wondered if he'd made the right decision or just postponed an inevitable tragedy. Voss interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, Raisin's convoy is 4 hours out, and we just got confirmation that he's bringing more than surface-to-air missiles. He's got a mobile radar system. Once that goes active, she won't be able to hide in the terrain anymore." Briggs nodded slowly. "Does she know?" "Should I tell her?" "No," Briggs said. "She's already working the problem. Telling her just wastes time she doesn't have." On the screen, Sarah's aircraft executed another impossible turn, threading between canyon walls with clearance measured in feet. The camera's algorithm tried to track her, lost the lock, reacquired, lost it again. Voss watched the display. "Sir, I've been analyzing her flight patterns. She's not just avoiding threats. She's creating a psychological profile of the enemy force, learning their response times, their firing discipline, their decision-making under pressure." Briggs leaned forward. "Explain." "Every engagement, she does something slightly different, changes her approach angle, her altitude, her weapon selection, and she's recording their responses. She's not just fighting them, she's studying them." "For what purpose?" Voss pulled up a tactical overlay showing Sarah's flight paths color-coded by time, so that when Raisin arrives with his overwhelming force, she'll know exactly how they think, and she can exploit it. Briggs allowed himself a thin smile. Hale trained her well. Hour 24 arrived with Sarah needing to execute the most psychologically damaging strike of the entire mission. She'd been thinking about it for the last 2 hours, refining the plan, calculating risks, accepting that success would buy her maybe 30 more minutes of operational time, but failure meant immediate mission compromise. The enemy had settled into defensive positions around the canyon, confident that Raisin would arrive soon and end this annoyance. They'd stopped being afraid of her, started treating her overflights as routine instead of threatening. That complacency was exploitable. Sarah descended to 200 feet and flew a wide reconnaissance pattern, using her sensors to map every enemy position, every vehicle, every piece of equipment they'd established. Then she identified her target. An abandoned outpost half a mile from the main enemy encampment. Stone walls, clear sightlines, and most importantly, a large flat surface facing directly toward where the fighters had concentrated. She landed on the access road nearby, grabbed the emergency spray paint from her survival kit, and ran to the outpost wall. Her legs protested, her body screaming that 24 hours of continuous operation was beyond sustainable limits. She ignored it and began painting. Large letters, 3 feet tall, in both Pashto and English so there could be no misunderstanding. You were spared. She stepped back, looked at the message, then added 3 more words underneath. Ask yourself why. The paint was bright orange, impossible to miss. When the sun came up fully, every fighter in the area would see it, would understand that she'd had dozens of kill shots and taken none of them, would realize that their survival wasn't luck or their skill. It was her choice. And that choice was an insult that cut deeper than any bullet. Sarah ran back to her aircraft, engine still running, and took off. She climbed to 500 feet and waited. 20 minutes later, as dawn light hit the canyon, she heard the enemy radio frequency explode with confused chatter. Chen translated in real time for Shelton's team. They're asking what it means. Their commander is demanding to know who wrote it. They're arguing about whether it's a threat or mockery. Then the part that made Sarah smile, despite her exhaustion. 15 fighters just left their positions. They're walking away, saying they won't fight for a commander who allows them to be humiliated like this. Shelton's voice came through the encrypted channel, carrying something close to awe. Ash, you just won a psychological victory without firing a shot. 1,600 rounds saved, Captain. Might need them later. How did you know that would work? Sarah thought about Hale, about lessons in human nature and the mathematics of pride. Because pride kills more soldiers than bullets, Captain. I just gave them a reason to feel ashamed instead of brave. She banked away, checking her watch. 4 hours until Raisin, 24 hours until Delta extraction. The math was still impossible, but now it was slightly less impossible than before. And in war, Sarah had learned, slightly less impossible was sometimes all you needed. Hour 26 arrived with the sun climbing toward afternoon and Sarah's body running on reserves that shouldn't have existed. She'd been awake for 38 hours straight, flying for 26 of them, her eyes dry and burning, her hands cramping on the stick. The right engine temperature had climbed into the red zone and stayed there. The gauge locked at a temperature that meant progressive damage was occurring with every minute of continued operation. She'd calculated that she had maybe 4 more hours before the engine seized completely or caught fire or simply quit. 4 hours would get her to hour 30, 6 hours short of Delta's extraction window. The gap was narrowing, but it wasn't closed. Sarah executed another orbit of the canyon, her movements precise despite the fatigue, muscle memory carrying her through maneuvers that her conscious mind was too tired to fully process. Below, the enemy had reorganized after the morning's desertions, but their movements were more cautious now, more hesitant. Fear and humiliation made a potent combination. Her radio crackled. Briggs, on the emergency frequency they'd established. Ash status update. Still flying, still annoying people. Engines degrading but functional, fuel at 30%. Raisin's convoy is 3.5 hours out. Our satellite shows he's got the full package. SAMs, radar, heavy weapons. When he arrives, your tactical advantage disappears. Understood, I'll adapt. Adapt how? You're one aircraft with failing systems against a mechanized force designed specifically to kill aircraft. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the landscape scroll past below her. Sir, do you know what my father used to say about crop dusters? Briggs sighed, no. He said they're the most honest aircraft ever built. They don't pretend to be fast or powerful or sophisticated. They just keep flying until the job is done or they can't fly anymore. And the pilots who fly them learn that success isn't about capability. It's about refusal to quit. That's a nice philosophy, Ash. But philosophy doesn't defeat SAM systems. No, sir. But it keeps you in the fight long enough to find the moment when the SAM systems make a mistake. The connection cut. Sarah banked into the wind, feeling the A-10 shudder, feeling the damaged engine cough once before stabilizing. 3.5 hours until Raisin arrived. 22 hours until Delta extraction. The impossible gap. But Sarah had stopped thinking about it as impossible. It was just a number, and numbers could be changed if you were willing to pay the cost. She descended back into the canyon one more time, and the fighters scattered at her approach. Good, let them stay scared. Fear bought time, and time was the only currency that mattered. Commander Alexei Raisin had spent 30 years learning how to kill people efficiently, and he approached the problem of one American pilot the way he approached everything else, with mathematical precision and absolutely no emotional investment in the outcome. His convoy rolled through the Montana wilderness in late afternoon light, 15 vehicles spaced at tactical intervals, headlights off, navigating by GPS, and the kind of night vision equipment that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. In the lead truck, Raisin studied a tablet showing real-time updates from his forward scouts. One aircraft, A-10 ground attack, pilot female, identity unknown, operating solo for 26 hours, no support, no reinforcements, no apparent plan except harassment and delay. And humiliation, his second-in-command added. His second-in-command, a Chechen veteran named Kadyrov who had fought in 3 wars and survived them all by being slightly more paranoid than everyone else, gestured at a photograph on the tablet. The message on the outpost wall. Your men are calling it an insult worse than bullets. Raisin studied the orange letters. You were spared. Ask yourself WHY. His smile was cold. She thinks psychology will save her. It won't. Brave and stupid often look the same until the shooting stops. Either way, she dies in 3 hours. He pulled up the tactical overlay, showing the canyon where 8 American soldiers had been pinned for more than a day. His scouts had confirmed their positions, their weapons load, their defensive capabilities. Without air support, they were a simple problem. With the A-10 overhead, they became complicated. But Raisin had brought tool, specifically designed to handle complications. 3 SA-18 grouse surface-to-air missile systems. Shoulder-fired, infrared-guided, effective range just under 4 miles. Each one carried by a trained operator who had successfully engaged aircraft before. And supporting them, a mobile radar unit that would light up the sky and make hiding impossible. Kadyrov gestured at the equipment manifest. The missiles are expensive, just for one pilot. Raisin closed the tablet. I have been fighting Americans for 3 decades. The ones who fly alone into impossible situations are never just pilots. They are symbols, and symbols must be destroyed completely or they multiply. How long until we reach engagement range? 3 hours. Raisin nodded, settled back into his seat, and closed his eyes. 3 hours until the American pilot learned the difference between courage and suicide. Sarah saw them coming on her thermal display long before they became a visible threat. 15 heat signatures moving in tactical formation, too disciplined to be anything except professional military. She'd been expecting this, had planned for it, but seeing the reality approach made the abstract mathematics of survival become something more immediate. She keyed her radio. Reaper 9, enemy reinforcements inbound. Multiple vehicles, heavy weapons probable. ETA 3 hours. Shelton's response was immediate. Copy, what's your plan? Make them think they're hunting me while I'm actually hunting them. That's not a plan, that's a fortune cookie. Sarah banked into a turn, descending to 100 feet. "Captain, I've been flying for 26 hours on decreasing fuel and failing equipment. If I had better plans, I'd be using them." "Fair point, how can we help?" "Stay alive, everything else is noise." She cut the connection and focused on the approaching convoy. 15 vehicles meant at least 60 fighters, possibly more. And if Raisin was smart, which Sarah assumed he was based on the disciplined movement patterns, he'd brought air defense systems, which meant her tactical advantage of altitude and mobility was about to disappear. Sarah climbed to 3,000 feet, high enough to see the full tactical picture, and began recording everything her sensors could detect: vehicle spacing, speed, formation changes, every piece of data that might give her an edge when the actual fighting started. Her right engine coughed again, longer this time, and she felt the aircraft shudder. She reduced throttle, bobbied it back to stable operation, and checked her fuel gauge. 22%. Maybe 3 hours of flight time remaining, maybe less. The math was becoming brutally simple. Raisin would arrive in 3 hours. Delta Force needed 21 more hours to reach extraction. Sarah needed to buy time she didn't have with resources that were running out. She descended back into the canyon and began the last phase of the mission. General Briggs stood in the operations center, watching multiple screens show the convergence of forces that would end with either a miracle or a tragedy. Probably tragedy. Miracles were in short supply in his line of work. Emma Voss had been running calculations for the last 30 minutes, and her face held the expression of someone who kept arriving at the same unpleasant answer. "Sir, even if she engages Raisin's convoy perfectly, delays them maximum time, she can only buy maybe 4 more hours. Delta needs 21. Briggs studied the map, the movement vectors, the cold mathematics of time and distance. "What are our options?" "Official air support violates operational security and triggers diplomatic incident. Extraction without air support results in approximately 70% casualties for Delta team. Abort mission entirely means 3 POWs get executed and 18 months of intelligence work becomes worthless." Briggs rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 58 years. "So our options are bad, worse, and catastrophic." "Yes, sir." He looked at the screen showing Sarah's aircraft, that small blip circling the canyon with the persistence of something that didn't know when to quit, or knew exactly when to quit and had decided not to. What would Hale do? Voss was quiet for a moment. "From what I've read about him, sir, he'd probably tell her to fly until the aircraft literally fell apart, and then find a way to keep fighting on the ground." Briggs allowed himself a thin smile. That sounds exactly like him. A technician called from across the room. "Sir, Raisin's convoy just deployed their radar system. It's active. She can't hide anymore." On the screen, Sarah's aircraft jinked hard right, evading something that had been fired at her. The first surface-to-air missile of the evening, launched optimistically at extreme range, missing by half a mile. But it was a message. The rules had changed. The safe spaces had disappeared. Briggs picked up the encrypted phone, the one that connected directly to Sarah's cockpit. She answered on the first ring. "They have SAMs," he said without preamble. "I noticed, sir. The one they just fired was instructive. You need to climb above their engagement envelope." "Can't do that. If I climb, I lose the terrain masking that's kept me alive for 26 hours, and Delta becomes exposed. If you stay low, they will eventually hit you." Sarah's voice was calm, almost peaceful. "Yes, sir, probably." "Ash, I can abort this. Bring in official support. Accept the diplomatic consequences." No, sir. That's not a request. That's me giving you an out. Respectfully, sir, I don't want an out. I want Delta extracted and those 3 prisoners freed. Everything else is acceptable cost. Even if the cost is you. Sarah was quiet for several seconds. Then, softer, sir, I died 10 years ago in a frozen canyon in Wyoming. They just forgot to bury me. Everything since then has been borrowed time. This seems like a good way to pay back the loan. Briggs wanted to argue, wanted to pull rank and order her to abort. But he'd spent enough time around people like Hale and Sarah to know that some decisions couldn't be unmade by authority. They could only be respected or disrespected. He chose respect. Godspeed, Ash. Thank you, sir. The connection cut. Voss looked at him. You just let her commit suicide. No, Briggs said quietly. I just acknowledged that she already made the choice, long before tonight. Hour 29 arrived with Raisin's convoy entering weapons range, and Sarah began the most complex tactical dance of her career. The SA-18 missiles had a maximum range of just under 4 miles and a minimum range of about half a mile. Inside that half-mile bubble, the missiles couldn't track fast enough to hit a maneuvering target. But reaching that bubble meant flying through 4 miles of engagement zone where she was vulnerable. Sarah's solution was to refuse to fly in straight lines. She approached the convoy at 100 feet, terrain masking her until the last possible second. When she popped up into their radar coverage, she was already launching flares and chaff, filling the air with false targets while diving back into cover. The first missile launch came from the convoy's right flank. Sarah saw the smoke trail, felt the missile's seeker lock onto her engine exhaust, and executed a maneuver that every flight instructor would have failed her for attempting. She cut throttle to idle, dove into a canyon-side channel that was barely wider than her wingspan, and pulled 7 GS in a climbing turn that made her vision narrow to a tunnel. The missile, unable to follow the radical direction change, impacted a canyon wall and detonated in a fireball that lit up the darkening sky. Sarah leveled out, read-venced the throttles, and her right engine coughed 3 times before stabilizing. Not good. She climbed back to attack altitude and spotted her target, Raisin's radar truck, the mobile system that was lighting her up for the missile operators. Without that radar, the SA-18s were reduced to visual targeting only, much less effective in fading light. But the radar truck was positioned in the center of the convoy, surrounded by protective vehicles, defended by fighters who knew exactly how valuable it was. Sarah armed her cannon, calculated angles, and committed to an attack run that would either disable the radar or get her killed trying. She dove from 2,000 feet, accelerating to 400 knots, the aircraft shaking from airframe stress. Tracers rose to meet her, green and red streams of bullets that looked almost beautiful in their lethality. She flew through them, accepting hits that rattled against her armored cockpit like hail on a roof. The radar truck filled her HUD. She fired. A 3-second burst. 90 rounds. The GAU-8 sounded like the voice of God having a bad day, a deep brrrrrt that could be felt as much as heard. The radar antenna disintegrated, shredded into fragments, the truck's electronics sparking and dying as 30-millimeter rounds tore through equipment that had cost someone a small fortune. Sarah pulled up hard, clearing the convoy by less than 50 feet, and climbed back into darkness. Behind her, Raisin's radar went dark. The SA-18 operators switched to manual targeting mode, searching the sky with eyes and thermal sights instead of electronics. It wouldn't keep her safe, but it would make their job harder. Shelton watched the fireworks from his position in the canyon, and tried to understand what kind of person flew like that. What kind of training produced a pilot who could thread between missiles and terrain and enemy fire with the casual precision of someone who'd stopped being afraid of death and moved on to being annoyed by it? Matteo crouched beside him, his attention split between the sky and their perimeter. "Sir, she just destroyed their radar at the cost of maybe 30 seconds of increased survival time." 30 seconds multiplied by every attack run she makes, Shelton said. "That adds up." "Adds up to what?" "To enough time for us to get out of here, maybe." Matteo was quiet, then carefully, "Sir, I need to tell you something." Shelton turned to look at him. "Go ahead." "I'm not just Delta Force. I'm CIA, have been for 2 years. My real mission was to infiltrate Raisin's network, gather intelligence on prisoner transfer operations." Shelton's face remained neutral. "And you're telling me this now because—" "Because she knows," Matteo said, gesturing at the sky where Sarah's aircraft had just reappeared. "Has known since the moment she arrived. And I think the real mission, the one we're not being told about, is prisoner extraction somewhere else. We're the diversion." Shelton absorbed this. "You have proof?" "The timing," Matteo said. "Raisin was supposed to be 200 miles east today, overseeing a transfer. Instead, he's here, chasing one pilot. Someone wanted him distracted." "If you're right, that makes us bait." Matteo nodded. "Expensive bait, but effective." Before Shelton could respond, Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "Reaper 9, enemy convoy is splitting. Main force continuing toward your position, but 3 vehicles just peeled off heading east. Fast." Shelton looked at Matteo. "East toward what?" "Toward where Raisin was supposed to be," Matteo said quietly. "Toward the prisoner compound." The pieces fell into place. Sarah wasn't just buying time for Delta's extraction. She was buying time for an entirely different operation, one that required Raisin and his forces to be focused on the wrong location, while the real rescue happened 50 miles away. Shelton keyed his radio. "Ash, how long do you need to keep Raisin occupied?" "Until my fuel runs out or my engine quits, whichever comes first." "And after that?" Sarah's laugh was brief and dark. "After that, Captain, I become a very expensive lawn dart." Hour 31 arrived with Sarah's fuel gauge showing 15%, and her right engine temperature locked in the red zone, where continued operation meant accepting damage that would eventually become catastrophic. Possibly in minutes, possibly in seconds. She'd been engaged by missiles 6 times in the last 2 hours, evading each one through a combination of terrain masking, flare deployment, and flying that existed somewhere between physics and faith. Her ammunition counter showed 300 rounds remaining, maybe 2 more engagements before she was Winchester. And Raisin's main convoy was still advancing toward Shelton's position, with the patient inevitability of something that knew time was on its side. Sarah checked her watch. Delta Force was 19 hours from extraction. The prisoner rescue team, wherever they were, needed probably 2 more hours of distraction. She had maybe 30 minutes of fuel remaining. The math didn't work, couldn't work, but mathematics had never been particularly good at accounting for human stubbornness. Sarah descended to 50 feet and began her final series of attack runs. The first pass targeted the convoy's lead vehicle, a technical truck with a heavy machine gun. She fired her remaining ammunition in precise bursts, disabling the gun mount, shredding the tires, leaving the vehicle crippled but the crew alive. The second pass targeted their fuel truck, but not to destroy it. She put rounds through the tank at an angle that created a leak, not an explosion. Fuel began pouring out, forcing the convoy to stop and deal with the problem or abandon the vehicle. They stopped. Sarah climbed back to patrol altitude and watched them organize. Watched them waste time. She was selling them 1 second at a time. Her engine coughed, died, restarted, died again. She was gliding now, trading altitude for distance, looking for anything that might extend her time in the air by even a few more minutes. That's when she saw the fuel truck, sitting stationary while Raisin's fighters worked to patch the leak, and she understood what Hale would have called a final option. The fuel truck contained maybe 300 gallons of diesel, not jet fuel, wrong type, but combustible enough for what Sarah had in mind. She banked toward it, diving from 1,000 feet, her dead engine creating a silence in the cockpit that felt almost peaceful. No more vibration, no more mechanical screaming, just wind noise and the sound of her own breathing. She armed her last weapon system, not the cannon. She was out of ammunition, but she still had flares, the emergency countermeasures that burned white-hot to distract heat-seeking missiles. Sarah descended to 20 feet, aligned her approach, and launched every flare she had remaining. They scattered across the terrain like falling stars, beautiful and deadly, igniting the diesel fuel that was pooling beneath the damaged truck. The fuel caught fire, the fire spread, and suddenly Raisin's convoy was cut in half by a wall of flame 40 feet high and 100 yards long. Sarah pulled up, using her last remaining momentum to climb, giving herself altitude that would translate into glide distance. Her left engine was still running barely, providing just enough thrust to keep her airborne. Below, Raisin's forces were in chaos, vehicles trying to navigate around the fire, fighters scattering, the organized military precision dissolving into improvisation. Sarah had bought another hour, maybe 90 minutes if the fire burned long enough. But her fuel gauge now read 8%, and 8% meant she had maybe 15 minutes before the left engine quit, and she became a glider in hostile territory. She keyed her radio one last time. Reaper 9, this is Ash. Corridor is clear for extract. You have maybe 90 minutes before they reorganize. Shelton's voice carried something Sarah had never heard from him before. Respect mixed with something close to awe. Ash, what's your status? Out of ammunition, out of fuel, out of time. The usual end-of-mission scenario. Can you make it back to base? Sarah looked at her instruments, did math that had only one possible answer. Negative, but that was always the plan. The plan was for you to die. The plan was for you to live, Captain. Everything else was negotiable. Where are you going to put down? Sarah scanned the terrain below, looking for anything flat enough and long enough to attempt a landing. There, maybe 2 miles ahead, a frozen lake, smooth enough to work if her approach was perfect and her luck held. Big ifs. Attempting emergency landing on frozen lake grid 47.8 north, 110.2 west. If I survive, I'll walk out. And if you don't survive, then tell Hale I remembered, fire and vanish. She cut the radio. The lake appeared ahead, silver-white in the moonlight, surrounded by pine forest that would kill her if she came in even slightly wrong. Sarah lowered her landing gear, felt the drag, accepted the loss of airspeed as necessary cost. Her left engine sputtered, coughed, died. Complete silence now except for wind noise, and the sound of hydraulics struggling to maintain control surfaces, with no engine power to drive them. Sarah was gliding, a 21,000-pound aircraft with the glide ratio of a brick, descending at 800 feet per minute toward a frozen surface that might or might not support her weight. She adjusted her approach, fighting sluggish controls, watching her altitude decrease. 1,000 feet, 800, 500. The lake was coming up fast. Too fast. She flared at the last possible second, bleeding off speed, trying to achieve that perfect balance between controlled landing and uncontrolled crash. The wheels hit ice, hard. The aircraft bounced, came down again, harder. The landing gear collapsed. The aircraft skidded on its belly, throwing up a rooster tail of ice and snow. The right wing hit something, tore off. The canopy cracked. Sarah was thrown forward against her harness, felt the violent deceleration, felt the aircraft spinning, tumbling, disintegrating around her. Then stillness. She hung in her harness, upside down, blood running into her eyes from a cut somewhere on her scalp. The cockpit was dark except for a few emergency lights still functioning on battery power. Sarah unstrapped, fell to what used to be the ceiling, crawled through the broken canopy. Cold air hit her face like a slap. She stood up, swayed, caught herself against the wreckage. Her right leg wasn't working correctly, probably broken. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, dislocated shoulder. But she was alive. Sarah looked at the wreckage of Iron Maiden, the aircraft that had kept her alive for 31 hours of impossible flying. The tail section had broken off completely. The wings were gone. The fuselage was split open like something that had been dropped from orbit. But the nose art was still visible. The woman in armor, sword raised, Iron Maiden. Sarah touched it with her good hand. Thanks for the ride. Then she heard the helicopters. 4 Blackhawks appeared from the north, flying low and fast. Delta Force extraction. They'd made it out of the canyon. The lead helicopter settled onto the ice 50 meters from the wreckage. Shelton jumped out before it fully landed, running toward her. He reached Sarah, caught her as she swayed. "You crazy son of a bitch." Sarah coughed blood. "Did they get out?" "All of them, 0 casualties. You bought us exactly the time we needed." "And the prisoners?" Shelton's face changed. "You knew about that." "Wasn't hard to figure out, Captain." "They're out. 3 POWs extracted from a compound 50 miles east while Raisin was chasing you. 18 months in captivity, coming home because you kept a convoy occupied long enough for the real rescue to happen." Sarah allowed herself to smile through the blood and pain. "Then I'd say the mission was successful." Shelton helped her toward the helicopter, supporting her weight. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 14 years. I've never seen anything like what you just did." 14 years is impressive, Sarah said, "but I had a very good teacher. The one who's dead. The one who taught me that some missions don't end when you die. They end when someone finishes them for you." They reached the helicopter. Medics swarmed, checking her injuries, starting IVs, immobilizing her leg. Sarah let them work, her eyes tracking back to the wreckage one last time. Shelton followed her gaze. "What was his name, your teacher?" "Hale, Major David Hale." "What did he teach you?" Sarah's voice was getting weaker as shock and blood loss caught up with adrenaline. "He taught me that the most important battles are the ones nobody knows you fought, and the best victories are the ones where everyone gets to go home except you." The helicopter lifted off, and through the window Sarah could see Iron Maiden's wreckage getting smaller, a broken aircraft on a frozen lake that would be recovered and analyzed and eventually displayed somewhere, as a reminder of what was possible when someone refused to accept impossible. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom at Nellis Air Force Base, leaning on a cane, her right leg still in a brace. The flight suit she wore had a new patch on the shoulder, "Fire Line," the one Tors had seen her wearing that night. 25 new pilots sat in front of her, fresh from training, ready to learn whatever the Air Force thought they needed to know about close air support and tactical operations, and all the official doctrine that looked good in manuals. Lieutenant Kai Novak, the same pilot who'd called Gatefire a fairy tale 6 months ago, raised his hand. "Ma'am, is it true you flew 31 hours on a single mission?" Sarah shifted her weight, her leg aching. Multiple refuelings, emergency repairs, and more borrowed time than I probably deserved. Another student, younger, asked the question they all wanted to ask. "How did you know you'd survive?" "I didn't," Sarah said simply, "but I knew someone had to try." She limped to the window, looked out at the flight line where A-10s sat waiting for their next missions. Why do we fly these aircraft? Why do we accept missions that look impossible? The classroom was silent. "Because someone has to be the person who doesn't turn back," Sarah said quietly. "Someone has to be willing to fly into situations where the math doesn't work, and the odds are terrible, and the only guarantee is that if you fail, people die." She turned back to the class. "That's not heroism. That's just the job. And if you're not prepared to be that person, find a different job." Novak spoke again, his voice respectful now. "Ma'am, what happened to the aircraft? Iron Maiden." Sarah pointed out the window. "They recovered her, rebuilt her. She's tail number 447, third from the left." The students looked. The aircraft sat on the line, fresh paint, new wings, the nose art repainted exactly as it had been. A woman in armor, sword raised. Below the nose art, someone had added a small plaque, "Fire Line, flown by Ash, January 2019. That night, Sarah returned to her apartment, the same sparse space with the same photograph of her father and the same model crop duster. But now there was something new. A letter, hand-delivered, sitting on her desk. No return address, no postage, just her name written in handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it. Inside, a USB drive and a single sheet of paper. "Captain Brennan, new situation, new timeline, grid coordinates attached, 48 hours, same rules, fire but don't kill, delay but don't destroy, solo operation, deniability total." The signature was 2 initials, EV. Emma Voss, the CIA analyst from Briggs's Operations Center. Sarah looked at the USB drive, then at the photograph of her father. She touched the frame gently. "Never fly higher than your heart," she read aloud. She plugged in the USB drive. Maps appeared. Coordinates. Thermal imaging of 8 heat signatures surrounded by hostiles in terrain that looked even worse than Montana. Sarah studied the data for a long time. Then she smiled, the same dark smile she'd had when she took off from Nellis without permission 6 months ago. Some people, she thought, never learn when to quit. She was already planning the fuel load when her phone rang. Briggs. "You got the package," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Voss says you're the only pilot she trusts for this. Says the operation requires someone who's comfortable operating in spaces that don't officially exist." "That's an interesting way to describe it, sir." "Will you accept?" Sarah looked out her window at the night sky, at stars that seemed closer than they should, at a darkness that held both threat and possibility. "Sir, I died 10 years ago. Everything since has been borrowed time. Seems wasteful not to spend it on something that matters." "Then you're activated. Mission brief at 0400, and Ash." "Yes, sir." "Try not to destroy this aircraft. The Air Force is running out of A-10s to rebuild." "I'll do my best, sir." She hung up, looked at the mission data one more time, and began packing her flight bag. Outside, wind moved through the Nevada desert, carrying sounds and smells and the promise of another day. But Sarah wasn't thinking about days. She was thinking about hours. 30, 40, however many it took to buy time for people she'd never meet, fighting battles that would never make the news, flying into impossible situations because someone had taught her that impossible was just a measurement of how hard you had to work. She picked up the photograph of her father, studied his face, his smile, his hand on her shoulder. "You were right," she said quietly. "Flying isn't about the machine. It's about will." She set the photo down, picked up her flight bag and walked toward the door. Behind her, the model crop duster sat on the window sill, yellow paint faded but still bright enough to catch the light. And somewhere in the darkness, engines were warming up for another mission that didn't exist, flown by a pilot who was already a ghost, buying time that couldn't be bought and paying for it with the only currency she had left. Borrowed time, spent one impossible hour at a time. The door closed behind her. The apartment went dark. And in the silence, the night waited for the sound of engines. 3 weeks researching this. What gets me isn't the impossible flying, it's hour 24. Captain Brennan hand-pumping 500 gallons of fuel with bleeding hands, knowing she might not make it back, and doing it anyway. That's the part they don't show in movies, the quiet pain, the decisions made alone. Question: would you have taken off without orders that night, or waited for clearance while 8 men died? Your answer below. If this one got you, the next Untold mission drops Friday. Subscribe so you don't miss it.